Welcome everyone to my rather unusual talk. This is a soft talk, which is a little bit out of my comfort zone, honestly. I normally do sort of like introductions to technology with a fun theme, which is why I do things like tracking aircraft with Redis and software-defined radio, or finding Bigfoot with JavaScript and vector search and things like that. But it does have a goofy theme, which is astrology, and it's a talk on just 7 bits of advice. You could call it career advice, but honestly, it's kind of life advice because career is a big part of your life, right? So it's called Beyond the Binary, 7 Odd Bits of Guidance for Geeks. My name is Guy Royse. I'm a developer advocate at Redis. So if you haven't heard of Redis, you totally should. I'd say go to the booth, but it'll probably be torn down by the time we're done here. But we're upstairs, so if you came by earlier. You can find me online at Guy Royse on X. I'm on Blue Sky as well. I don't have it on my slides yet, but who here is a Blue Sky user? A few of you? It's growing. Everyone's been moving towards it. I'm at guy.dev, which is my domain name as well. And normally I'd say I've got code at GitHub and you want to go check that out, but I don't have any code for this because it's a soft talk. And go check out Redis as well. So, this is a talk about astrology, but it's really a talk about life advice. And it's easy to look at astrology and poo-poo it, right? I don't believe in astrology. I'm skeptical about astrology, and that's probably because I'm a Pisces, and that's just how we are. But I think there's utility in the categories that astrology talks about. They're talking about things that humans are and do, even if the position of the sun and the moon, Mars and Jupiter in the sky isn't necessarily having a relevance to like my personality. The personality traits they talk about are things that people have. These categories describe real things. And so you've got, in classic astrology, there are 7 planets. The sun, which represents your identity, yourself, your ego. The moon, which represents your secret self, your emotions. You've got Mercury, which represents reasoning and logic and communication. It's kind of interesting if you think about it. If you think about looking at the planets in the night sky, obviously the sun and moon aren't planets, but they consider them planets for astrology. But Mercury is spinning around really fast close to the sun. And so you can imagine ancients looking up into the sky and saying, I bet you he's running messages. And, so he's the messenger. You have Venus, which represents relationships and love. This is about career stuff, so we're going to talk about relationships. We got Mars, which I'm going to use as an idea of action, but it is very action-oriented. I mean, obviously Mars is the god of war as well. You've got Jupiter, which is growth, and Saturn, which is structure or authority. And so these are things that are real, even if where Jupiter is in my horoscope when I'm born, it really has no impact on me. And so, yeah, that's what we're going to talk about today. I'm going to have a little bit of guidance for each planet. And I mentioned this idea of categories. Like the science behind this is suspect, but the categories themselves are meaningful. You might be familiar with the Greek idea of humors, right? Where it was a health idea. It's like you had 4 basic humors: blood, black bile, yellow bile, and phlegm. And the idea is that if you had too much of one of these in your system, you were out of balance. And this is not how it works at all, right? and George Washington died because it doesn't work this way at all, because they let out blood because he was ill. But they extracted these ideas and said, okay, you have health ailments, but it also translates into personality traits. And so someone who has too much blood, a little more blood than average, they're sanguine. It literally means blood. Someone who's sanguine is bubbly and outgoing and personable. I have been accused of being sanguine. And because they had too much blood. Now, having too much blood doesn't make me sanguine, but sanguine is a category that people fall into. There are sanguine people out there. Many of you are. Melancholy. That means you had too much black bile. Literally, the word means melon, which is black, like melanin, and kali, which means bile. So literally, and someone who has too much black bile is melancholy. They're brooding perfectionists. Someone who's choleric tends to be controlling. They don't feel good about themselves unless they've accomplished something today. Unlike me, I'm happy to sit and watch videos on YouTube all day long. Probably because I'm a Pisces. But choleric is someone who had too much yellow bile. And literally, that coal in there means bile. Phlegmatic kind of speaks for itself. It's someone who has too much phlegm. And they tend to be diplomatic and passive and hardworking. And so these are categories that are meaningful, even though the underlying, I'm going to use air quotes and say science behind them is bunk. And I don't mean that in a denigrating way to the ancients who came up with these ideas. They were working with what they had, right? And so, they didn't have as much knowledge as we do. And so they're not bad theories, they're just wrong. But yeah, these categories are meaningful categories. I actually took a test, personality test when I worked for an insurance company many years ago. And they had these 4 categories and put you into quadrants in it. And they were promoter, analyzer, controller, and supporter. This is sanguine, melancholy, choleric, and phlegmatic. These are still relevant categories, even though the humors have nothing to do with them. And that's sort of a theme of this talk, is that these categories are meaningful even if the actual things themselves that they're based on aren't. And the other theme that I kind of want to get into this talk, which is it's the beyond the binary. Because you're sanguine, you're melancholy, you're choleric, you're phlegmatic. They're not yes or no. It's not I'm sanguine, I'm not sanguine. It's how sanguine am I? And it's not I'm one or the other. I have levels. We all do. I'm fairly sanguine. I'm also a little bit melancholy. I'm not particularly choleric. Hence the sit around and watch YouTube videos all day. Perfectly fine with that until I get depressed. That's the melancholy. And phlegmatic. We all have varying ratios of these inside of ourselves. So that's the theme for the talk. This alone, I think, is actually a useful framework because you can look at people, you can start categorizing them and say, well, you're a really phlegmatic person. And then you can start understanding how they work as a human. It's a useful category. So let's go through the seven planets of classical astrology, which also correspond to the 7 metals of alchemy, and just look at some lessons that I've sort of figured out and associated with these things. I've got the first time I did this talk, it took me 90 minutes, but I had a lot of interruptions. We've got, I think, about 38 left, so I probably should talk fast. So we'll look at the sun first. Sun is your identity. It's represented by gold. It represents gold in alchemy. And identity is one of those tricky things, right? You put things in your identity, and some people put things in your identity for you. Like your family. Like you identify with your name. Like if I ask you who you are, you give me your name. That's what we think of when we think of our identity. And so that's an obvious one. You go for your name, you go for your gender, you go for your family. I'm Guy Royse. I come from a long line of Royces. I'm a father and a son. A culture plays into this as well. Obviously, I'm an American. I suppose I could technically be Canadian, but I'm not. And this is a thing that you tend to get as well. Where are you from? What's your culture? What's your background? I'm an American. I'm from Ohio. I'm the son of mountain men. I'm a Westerner. I'm a Christian. These are things that you tend to be given. Some identity you choose. I work for Redis. I like getting a paycheck, so I like working. But Redis is a part of my identity. People ask me, "Who are you?" And a Redisan, as we like to say, is part of my identity. And some of it is just the things that we work on and the languages we choose. So, I like JavaScript as a programming language. I like it better than TypeScript, even though for some people those are fighting words. I think spaces are better than tabs. Don't at me. Or I wrote this code. And these things can get into your identity as well. But there's a problem with putting things in your identity, which is that if someone attacks a thing and you've made it a part of you, a reflection of yourself, you start feeling a little defensive. This is kind of okay if someone's attacking your family, I can get behind the idea. It's like if someone says, you're a terrible person because you're a Royse. Well, those are fighting words, right? That can be okay. But if someone looks at the open source code I wrote for Redis, that's, my last name isn't Redis. It's not me, it's the thing I produced. And it has room for improvement, everything does. And so you've got to be careful about what you choose to allow into your identity. Actually, I have Redis on the next slide here as an example. Anyone here maintain any open source libraries? A few of you? You ever bristle at some of the issues and comments that are opened up? It's like, oh, God, I don't like that person. This is what happens when you let these things into your identity. Let's see, what do we got here? So, but this identity thing is not it is me or it isn't me. There's a continuum here, right? There are things that are Guy. There are things that are not Guy. And they are on a spectrum. And so there are things that are very solidly me. I'm a father. I'm a Royse. That's pretty deeply embedded in my sense of self. I'm a nerd. I'm an American. I'm a Christian. There are things that are a little less embedded. I work for Redis. Redis is important to me. I like working for Redis. It's a great place to work. And I do identify with it. But someday I won't work there and I'll work somewhere else and I'll identify with them instead. And then I'll identify as a former Redis employee. I'm a gamer. I'm an amateur radio operator, Whiskey 8, Golf Uniform Yankee. I used to do a bunch of Agile coaching, and so I think of myself as an Agilist. I'm a public speaker. These are things that are in my identity, but they're not as strongly in my identity. And then there are things that are more loosely in my identity. I have my various ideas that you come up with. People get attached to their ideas, and someone attacks your ideas, you get defensive. That's a sign that it's part of your identity, and really probably shouldn't be. Or your code. No one likes to have their code criticized, but if you really don't like it, you're wrapping that up into your identity. And so my first bit of advice here is choose very carefully the things that you allow into your identity. Because when people attack them, then it hurts. And sometimes it's just not necessary. There's no need to get defensive when someone criticizes your code. So that's number one. Number two, emotions. This is represented by the moon, which is the metal silver in alchemy. It's your inner self, your secret self. And there's two, some of you may have a good guess as to what's coming next. There's two obvious things that we can talk about with your emotional state, your inner self. The first one is imposter syndrome. I'm guessing 80% of you in here have heard of imposter syndrome. Imposter syndrome is that sense that everyone else seems like they know what they're doing, and I'm a total fraud and I don't belong here. I'm experiencing it personally right now. Imposter syndrome it's tricky, right? Because it gets in your head, but it's a lie. I used to coach pair programming when I did Agile stuff, and I would always tell them, people would be resistant to the idea of pair programming because they were afraid that they would be revealed as a fraud, because they're looking around and they're seeing all these people that look really competent, and they know they're not. But their mistake they're making is they're judging their inside against everyone else's outside, which is a huge mistake. And the reality of it is both people kind of feel like that when they go into a pair programming session. And often that would be enough to get someone over the anxiety of that. This is a thing that happens to me. Every single time I give a talk about data science, I'm insecure. And I always prefix it with these words here. I am not a data scientist. Because I know that there's a data scientist out there that's going to tell me I'm wrong. At least that's how it feels. I mean, occasionally that does happen. Because I'm not a data scientist. But, I used to work for Data Robot, actually, and I was greatly relieved when I quit and joined Redis instead, because I could stop talking about all this machine learning and AI stuff. Whoops. So everyone is talking about vector databases now, and so now I'm back into that space where I have to talk about a thing that I feel like I understand well enough that I can explain it, but I also feel like I'm kind of I don't have the depth of knowledge that I should in order to present it in front of a crowd. And so that imposter syndrome is still there. And we all experience this. The opposite of the imposter syndrome is the Dunning-Kruger effect. This is where I think I'm all that, because I learned a little bit. This is not a bad thing. I think this is just part of the learning curve. This is what part of learning is, that I feel you learn a little bit and it's like, wow, this thing could go anywhere, right? And you just get a sense of confidence. It's misguided, but it's natural. I like to think about driving. So we all presumably learned to drive, right? This is my son, Lucas. He was 15 at the time. Actually, he just got married on Saturday, so which is exciting. So no applause necessary, just give them money. This is him. When we were 15, we were shopping for cars, and he hopped in the Mustang, and he's sitting there, he's like, hello, ladies. But the reason I'm showing you this picture is because there's a point when you're learning to drive where you're like, I got this, I know what I'm doing. And that's when you get your accident. That's when you make the mistake, because you're overconfident. I've actually done this myself. I remember early in my career, I was asked to rate myself on a scale of 1 to 10 on how well I knew SQL. And I'm like, SQL, that's easy. 10. Well, you know, no, I was wrong. I still got the job. I backpedal really, really good. But this is an easy thing to do. We all do this as well. And it's actually really kind of a deeper pattern. It's a return to the mean. So let's get this chart up here. So at the bottom here, we have ignorance and mastery of a topic. And this line, the pink line, represents your confidence. And initially, you're very confident because your confidence grows quickly. And when you're at that peak confidence, that's the Dunning-Kruger effect. You're at the peak of Mount Stupid. But you haven't looked into the valley yet, and so you don't realize how deep the rabbit hole actually goes, so you're overconfident. What happens after a while is once you get over that peak, you find yourself overcompensating in the other direction. You're in imposter syndrome. You're in the valley of despair. It's like, oh, I actually don't know anything, and I'll never know this. And then over time, you get into reality. I call it reality land, where you have an accurate assessment. And this is simplified. I think it's actually a little bit more of like a ripple over time. But the goal, of course, is that you want to get through the Dunning-Kruger, and you need to get through the imposter syndrome, and then you can just have an accurate assessment of where you really are and not have your identity wrapped up in it. And this pattern is actually it happens at scale. Anyone ever hear of the Gartner hype cycle? Same pattern. There's an innovation trigger. A new thing becomes possible. And everyone's like, this thing could go anywhere. AI might be at the peak of inflated expectations right now, where you're coming up and it's like, it's going to do this, and it's going to do this, and it's going to do all these amazing things. And then at some point we realize, oh, we've overhyped it. And we get into the trough of disillusionment afterwards. And then the slope of enlightenment and the plateau of productivity. And so this is just Dunning-Kruger at scale. That's all it is. The same pattern. This is just a normal human thing as well. And in fact, this is also not I'm in Dunning-Kruger or I'm in imposter syndrome. This is a bit of a spectrum as well, because every day is a little different. Some days you come in and you're like, I really know what I'm doing, and other days you're doing the same thing. I mean, we've all had this experience as developers, right, where you're coding along, it's like, I am a programming god, and then, oh my God, I'm an idiot. And you go through that mind shift when you're writing code. And so the second bit of advice is live at the intersection of Dunning-Kruger and imposter syndrome. If you're always in imposter syndrome, it's a wrong assessment. If you're always in Dunning-Kruger, that's an incorrect assessment. You want to try and strike the balance between the two. Okay, next one. I think I'll have enough time. This is Mercury. It represents reasoning. Its metal is, well, mercury or quicksilver. And the thing here that I think everyone needs to understand is that it's always a trade-off. Everyone wants to have their cake and eat it too, but you can't. You have to make the trade-off. And I always kind of said it's always a trade-off in sort of like a discouraged sort of way. It's like, why does it always have to be a trade-off? It's kind of like, but it does always have to be a trade-off, because if there was no trade-off, that'd just be how you do it. There's lots of things that aren't trade-offs, and you just go do them. Eating is not, well, eating is a trade-off, I suppose, because you can't eat cake every day. But there's lots of things where there's not really a lot of, you don't have to give up anything. And so you just go do them. And a classic example of it's always a trade-off is the good, fast, cheap iron triangle, pick two. We've all seen this, right? I hope we've all seen this. Pick two. You can have it good and fast, but then it's going to be expensive. You can have it quickly, and it can be cheap, but it's going to be garbage. Should pick two. There's a lot of trade-offs like this that we have to make in software development. An example is CAP theorem. For those who aren't in the know, CAP theorem, anyone? A few of you? The idea is that in distributed systems, you have a choice between prioritizing consistency in the data or availability of the data. And different databases do this differently. I think that technically, most databases, because it's about distributed systems, they're either going to be CP, meaning it is partition tolerant and prioritizes consistency of the data, or it's AP because it prioritizes availability and partition tolerance. But I suppose technically you could have a CA database which is just not networked, and because it's not distributed, so partitions can't happen. And so I've given some examples of databases that sort of classically fall into these categories. You got HBase, Cassandra, and SQLite. Of course, this is a little bit of a misrepresentation because Cassandra can be configured in such a way that it actually can be more consistent and less available by changing the quorum amount. So it has tunable consistency. So these are trade-offs we make. And really it's more of there's a triangle here of places. You can pick lots of points on this triangle here. So like with Redis, if you just have a standalone Redis instance, it's consistent and available because it's up and it's one source of truth. There's nothing to coordinate. There's no network to split. It's great. If you implement replication with Redis, it makes it a little bit more consistent and partitionable. So if one of your nodes goes down, replication comes up, pops up, keeps your data available. It's a little more partition tolerant and a little less consistent because data might not have been replicated. But you can also set up clustering and Sentinel so that it's got a priority on availability versus consistency. So lots of our tools are like this. We can make these trade-offs between availability and consistency and partition tolerance. Another example of a trade-off that I like is why can't we use the cool programming languages argument? Right? There's all these cool programming languages out there. We all want to use them, right? Who wants to do Rust? Well, okay, maybe just me. There's a few of us out there, right? Who wants to do Haskell? No, I don't actually. But there's all these cool programming languages, and why can't we use them? Why are we stuck doing Java and C# and JavaScript and Python? And if you got offended because I just called those the boring languages, then you need to go back to the first section on identity and choosing very carefully what you allow into your identity. So I have this idea around this that this has to do with a intersection of the capability of the language and the capability of the developers that are out there to actually write code. And so I'm going to present two harsh truths about programmers. So this bell curve represents capability. And this represents engineering availability. The harsh truth is that programmers are on a bell curve. Many of us have seen this meme, right? You've got the dimwit on the left, you've got the Jedi on the right, you've got the midwit in the middle, right? So the first harsh truth is that programmers are on this distribution curve. The second harsh truth, you're probably the person in the middle. I know I've been, I'm going to over-engineer the thing, right? Well, you take this with the complexity of software programming languages, where the capability of it grows to the right. As the capability grows, the complexity of that language increases. And so you get some languages that are very accessible to programmers because they're under the bell curve, and some that are right around that peak of the bell curve, and some that are above that bell curve. And so down here, you've got things like maybe PHP, and this is where everyone's going to cancel me. Or Lua, which tend to be fairly simple programming languages that lots of people can use. Businesses don't tend to use them a ton, although PHP is a noted exception, because there's more capable languages that there's plenty of people to operate. And so you end up with more things. Actually, that's the next one. Then you got the harder languages like C++, Scala, Rust, and we've all done a lot of these. But they require, it's harder to find developers for them because you just have to be a more capable developer to know what a monad is. And so what happens is the bulk of the businesses, unless they have a need for these languages where they can't find developers that know them, stick with the safe ones. And they pick things like JavaScript and Python and C# and Go and those sorts of languages. And so we all often spend a lot of our time there. And so this is a trade-off that businesses make. capability of a language versus the availability of developers to work on it. I actually worked for a startup once where we went all Elixir, and then we couldn't find any, which was really cool, but then we couldn't find any Elixir developers. Yeah. Well, there's one over there. That's good. And that was a problem for us because then we had to train up a bunch of developers instead, and that slowed us down, and we honestly probably should just use Java or something, even though that's kind of boring by comparison. So the third lesson here is understand that it always depends. There's always a trade-off to be made. So, fourth one, relationships. This is represented by Venus. The metal is copper. The little symbol for Venus there is actually a mirror. It represents a mirror. In the ancient world, mirrors were made of copper. They would polish them and use those as mirrors because silver was too expensive. And they couldn't make glasses at high enough quality to create a thin coating. Now, I could talk about the obvious thing here, which is we should basically be excellent to each other and have good relationships with our coworkers and those sorts of things. But I mean, I think we all know that, right? Bill and Ted taught me when I was in high school that we should be excellent to each other. And so instead, I thought I'd talk about networking. We've all heard that expression. It's not what you know, but who you know, right? And the way I always heard that was disparaging. There's a sense that there was the person that knew things, and there was the person that knew people. And the person knew people, and they didn't really know anything. They were just there because they were connected. And I don't think I'm the only person that's had this sense before. It's wrong, but it's there. My father-in-law worked in a foundry, and the people that were in charge, he called them the white shirts, because they weren't actually melting metal and casting bodies for pumps. They would come down and tell them how to do their job. And we've got this sort of dichotomy that we've created where it's either what you know or who you know. And in some ways we're correct in that assessment, because if you have a network but you don't have anything to offer, that is useless. Like, I can know lots and lots of people, but if I don't have any skills to offer those people, what's the point? I'm just well connected. I'm basically a celebrity at that point. And so as developers, what we will often do is we'll go to the opposite extreme, and we'll say, well, I just need to be all about the coding, and this networking stuff is for chumps, and I'm not doing it. And that's wrong too. Because what you really need to do, because if you can have all the skills in the world, but if you don't have anyone to share them with, you can't bring that value to anyone. And so you need to have a network and skills. You need to do both. So don't just focus on being the fastest typer or the best coder, and don't just focus on being connected and knowing people. Do both. I actually read a great book on this. No talk of this nature would be complete without a book reference. So this is a book called The Formula, The Universal Laws of Success. And he talked about networking versus performance. And excuse me. And he had two main points that I thought were really interesting. He said, performance drives success. But when performance can't be measured, networks drive success. So if you're really good at a thing and it's really easy to measure, like you're a baseball player and your batting average is right there, it's measurable, it's a hard piece of data, it's really easy to measure, then you can be successful at that. If it's harder to measure, then the network tends to drive success. And he used an example of art versus sports. And by art, I mean, sports is sports. But by art, I don't mean the sort of art that is beautiful paintings and that sort of stuff, but more of the avant-garde stuff like this. Anyone recognize this? I'm not translating it, but I actually saw this in a museum in Milan. This is the artist being critical of how the art world worked, and so he literally put his feces into a can and put it on display, and then everyone started making commentary about how this was a bold statement about this, that, and the other, and he was trying to say this is a bunch of crap. So that's the kind of art he's talking about. That kind of art is about who you know more than what you're doing. Or if I just set up a toilet in the middle of an art gallery. And so he used these two examples to kind of show the extreme and found that networks, people that were in larger places, where they had more opportunities to network were more successful as artists than in smaller places, even though they were doing the same sorts of things. Whereas with sports teams, it didn't matter where you were from. If you could do the thing, you could do the thing. So, really interesting concept. His other thing, other than performance driving success, is that performance is bounded. I can only do so much in a day. The success, because it's measured by the network, is unbounded. And so by being able to do a thing and having a network in which to do it, you can maximize success. So this is really interesting. It's a great book. He has some other principles, but it's worth checking out. But the lesson here is, you want me to get that back so you can get a photo of the book? There you go. I say I bought the book, but I listened to the book. I didn't read it. So, but the lesson here is build a network. It's very important, but don't solely build a network. Do both. It's not one or the other. Next is Mars, which is iron and action. So this is one where my wife has this saying that, let's see, here it is. I got my notes now. My wife has this saying, if the price of doing something is up front, it's worthwhile. If the price is after the fact, it's not. And I have this picture of this fat tattooed guy because he's my dad. No, just kidding. I don't have any tattoos. I kind of love this guy though because he's got a beer and a piece of fried chicken, and it's great. But he's paying the price after the fact, right? And my wife actually says this in the context of weight loss. She actually did Weight Watchers and lost 150 pounds on it. And so this is something that she has really taken to heart. And there's a lot of places where this is true. It's not just about eating. I mean, obviously, I'm not very good at this one. but it's still an important thing to know. It applies to all sorts of things. This idea of paying that price up front. Technical debt, or real debt, is something that's cheaper to pay up front than it is after the fact. It isn't to say you should never have debt. I have a mortgage because I want to have a house. There is appropriate debt. But generally, paying that price up front rather than after the fact is very valuable. One example that I like to go to is JavaScript versus TypeScript. I actually don't like TypeScript very much. I feel like I'm playing type Sudoku to try and figure out what I should be using as my correct type there, just to make the compiler happy. And I know I could totally just make it work immediately in JavaScript. But it's a way of paying a price up front because the errors that you can get without the typing will be caught by the typing. And it's a lot harder to pay, it's a lot more expensive to pay for that when you find it in production than it is when you are writing your code and Visual Studio Code nags you about your type being incorrect. So JavaScript versus TypeScript, even though I prefer JavaScript, I use TypeScript. And in fact, I had to learn TypeScript in order to create Redis Ohm. So Redis Ohm is an object mapping library for Redis that I wrote. It's for Node. We have ones for Python and all the other languages. I did the one for Node developers. And I could have just written one in JavaScript and then added a typing later, but that would have been a lot more difficult and expensive. And I would have been playing those games where, like in JavaScript, you can take types and play loose with them, right? And passing things can be multiple things and do sort of fake polymorphism. TypeScript makes that, it challenges you and makes that harder to do. But if you have to add the type after the fact, then you've got these really complex types, and so it's cheaper to pay it up front. Redis has recently introduced a vector, well, not recently, we've had it for a while, but we've got a vector database capability. It would be really easy for me to just use it in a cookie cutter cookbook formulaic sort of fashion and just use it and say, well, I do this thing and then it's magic and I don't have to think about it. But when I run into a problem, because I've misused it without realizing it, I have to pay a price, and that price can be in production. If I learn how the embeddings and the vector stuff works up front and then use it, I can use it more wisely without avoiding these mistakes. And so I'm paying a price up front to avoid prices later. Actually, I used to be terrified of public speaking, and I had a boss that pushed me into doing this. And so I went ahead and did it and learned how to do public speaking. And now I have a career of it. So yeah, I did a difficult thing up front to get me to a, rather than paying it after the fact. So the lesson here in the action is take action, do the thing, pay that price up front, don't wait till later. So I think I may actually finish this on time. So Jupiter represents growth. And this is where I've got kind of a weird story. This is where the idea of making this astrology themed actually came from. So growth can come from a lot of places. I want to focus on learning. And there's a story at the heart of this talk that I think is kind of fun. So I used to be a consultant. I worked for a consulting company in central Ohio, and we were at a large health provider there. And they were doing something that I think is kind of a bad idea, but they were being careful. They were using timestamps, ISO 8601 timestamps as dates. And the thing that they were particularly doing wrong is that they decided that the one true time zone was Eastern time in Columbus, Ohio, right? And they were careful, and they made sure that all the dates were exactly what they should be, and they took daylight savings time into account and did all the things. But there's a risk here that if you get that wrong, that because you're right at midnight, it could become yesterday if you get your time zone wrong, because there's an off by one error lurking there. Well, they had done this, and they were running into a weird bug. And their weird bug was the back end for everyone's birth dates was consistent and correct. They'd watch the date come over the wire, over the rest call, and it was correct. And then on the front end, in a few rare occasions, there'd be people whose birthday was the previous day. They tended to be elderly, and they couldn't figure out why. And they couldn't find any pattern to it. And they'd been trying to solve it for days. So I come in there, having read lots of weird stuff about astrology as a kid, and I remembered a tidbit from a book. And that was that between February 9th, 1942 and September 30th of 1945, which was the date ranges for all the people that were having unusual birthday issues, the federal government instituted wartime, which made daylight savings time permanent. And I also knew that the front-end library they're using, which was Moment.js at the time, only stored data until 1950. And so they were getting an off by one error on a few birthdays of older patients who were born in the 40s. And so I walked up to them, looked at their situation, and gave them an answer in 5 minutes. And because I studied astrology as a kid, I looked like a consulting god. And you could look at that time studying astrology in my youth as wasted time, because, astrology is bunk, right? But I learned an interesting tidbit that actually helped my career, and honestly helped a bunch of people save a bunch of time. And so the lesson here is that you should just learn stuff, right? Don't worry about what you're learning. I mean, some attention should be paid to that. But for the most part, as long as you keep learning, you're going to be okay, because you really don't know what's going to be useful and what isn't. You have no way of predicting that out. I had no way of knowing that astrology would help me solve a consulting problem, a date time problem. How random, right? You just don't know what's going to be useful. So just learn stuff and keep learning and be curious, and some of it will be useful and some of it won't. So last one here is on structure. So years ago I saw this diagram. It was called the bright center or the shining sun diagram. And the idea here is that you would draw a circle and you put the sun in the middle of it, and then you would put your customers and competitors and partners and all your businesses on it, and you would then plot yourself on it and see how you compare to all the people that were in your field. And the idea was you probably shouldn't be doing business with Dunder Mifflin, but you should totally be hanging out with the Tyrell Corporation. Right? That was the idea. And this is solid, right? This is a solid idea. You just get an assessment of what the field looks like, who's in it, and who you should be pursuing as partners. Great idea. But then they did something gross, and they extended it to people. And I don't like that. I don't like that at all, because people are valuable. And I don't think you should treat people like that. And so I looked at it and I said, that's wrong, right? That's completely wrong. You should not be saying, Dave's doing weird stuff. I don't want to hang out with Dave. I'm going to totally hang out with Alice, who's doing the mainstream stuff. And so I think I updated the diagram and I moved my pointer over here. Because I think the fringe, the edge, is where the interesting stuff happens, right? And this isn't just with people. Like the people out there, Dave and Frank, they probably got some really weird ideas, but some of them have some nuggets of good in them. And Alice is up there, and Bob, and they're kind of just doing kind of what everyone else is doing. And you can actually see this pattern play out both in just, like literally in parties. You ever go to a party and like everyone's glommed up? And they're glommed around like the cool kids? Right? This gave me cool kid vibes when I first, maybe I'm just triggered because of my high school experience. But the people on the edges have really interesting ideas. And this isn't just about people, this applies to technology too, right? And these don't stay still, they move around. And so Java is, a shining center. It's where a lot of people are doing. It's very mainstream. Zig is an up and coming language, maybe. Rust and Haskell have moved in. Maybe Haskell's moving on its way out. I don't know. I keep dunking on Haskell. It's because I don't know what a monad is, and no one seems to be able to explain it to me once they learned what it is. But you got unusual languages out here that you can learn interesting things from. I remember when I first heard about Rust, it was way out there on the fringe. No one was doing it, but it had really neat ideas in it. And you can learn from those things on the fringe. Anyone heard of Futhark as a programming language? Right. I haven't either. No, I actually have, yeah. I looked at it, it's like some sort of mathy thing. It's kind of like an R, and it's really esoteric, but it's way out there on the fringe, but I bet you there's something worthwhile learning in it. And so if you go out and learn it, is that going to be a waste of time? Probably not. You might learn things. And so the last lesson here is hang out on the fringe, because that's where the interesting stuff happens. So, and just for everyone who wants to get the good photos, I got a summary of all of them. So here are the 7 odd bits of guidance for geeks. Choose very carefully the things that you allow into your identity, because if you allow it into your identity, when people attack it, it's going to bother you. Live at the intersection of Dunning-Kruger and imposter syndrome. That's where you really are. Understand that it always depends, because if it didn't, that'd just be how you do it. It's always a trade-off. Build a network, but don't solely build a network. You need to be skillful and connected. Pay the price up front. It's cheaper. Focus on learning over what you learn. You don't know what's going to be useful. And hang out on the fringe. That's where the cool stuff happens. So that's my talk. I think I did it in I got a minute and a half left. So thanks a lot.